I would like to move on to the next speaker, Professor Justin Tiwald from San Francisco State University. And his talk, the title of his talk is Confucian Constitutionalism Without Remedies. Okay, Justin, do you want to share your...
Yes, I do want to share screen. I'll start sharing screen in just a minute. I wanted to have
Okay.
remarks.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. I've been looking forward to this event. The book is splendid, and it's always nice to speak with other well-informed people about the book. I see a lot of friends and colleagues in the audience, so I'm really enjoying this event, and many thanks, Young-sun, for the invitation. So this will be my talk is going to be about constitutionalism and Confucianism, but in pursuit of that topic, I'm going to say a little bit about rebellion, and this will be the second time that Professor Kim and I have had a discussion about rebellion. The first time we had a discussion about it, we didn't know that we were discussing it with each other because he had submitted a paper anonymously to a journal that they had then given to me. And I learned something very dark about my own soul in that discussion. So the original version of the paper had been about, I don't know, somewhere between 30 and 50% devoted to criticisms of my view about Mencius and rebellion. And then I, in my comments, said, well, I think you're of course, reviewers are always defensive. So I said, I think you're misreading Tiwald. And so I suggested that he read Tiwald a different way. And Professor Kim wrote back, no, I think this is the right reading of Tiwald. So we went back and forth anonymously in this manner for a while. And then finally, I think the editor got tired of being the go-between in our discussion. So she decided that she would just reveal to Professor Kim that I was Justin Tiwald. And so I think the assumption was that I spoke with more authority about what I meant, which I don't think is a safe assumption. So in any case, that settled the matter. And Professor Kim was so honest and had so much intellectual integrity that he revised his paper so that there was then just maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs about the right of rebellion in the paper. And what I learned about my own soul is that deep in my heart, I'm a publicity hound because I was disappointed that what had originally been a paper that was largely about my work, but a criticism, was now just only sort of nominally about my work. So I think it was P.T. Barnum who's supposed to have said that he doesn't care what the newspapers say about him so long as they get his name right. I think that's what I discovered about my innermost desires as well. Anyway, it's nice to come full circle with you again, Sung Moon, and to talk about rebellion again. So I'm going to share screen. I have PowerPoint slides. This isn't something, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Okay.
So I will change you to as a host. So just wait a moment.
Okay, no problem. So this is not, okay, yes, that should work now. Good. Not always a good idea for me to use PowerPoint slides, but we'll give it a try. Okay, so the topic is Confucian constitutionalism without remedies. So the turning point, a sort of pivotal issue in my comments on Professor Kim's book has to do with whether we can have constitutionalism without constitutional remedies. That is, some way of further guaranteeing or ensuring that the legitimate political authorities respect constitutional limitations or constraints. So here's a sort of quick version of my comments, the sort of a brief version. I'm going to start by talking about various senses of the word constitutionalism, and both my own and Professor Kim's. Then I'm going to discuss his account of Xunzi's ritual constitutionalism, which I like, and I think it's a great heuristic, but I have some reservations. And then I'm going to conclude with, I think, the sort of main issue, which is to talk about the grounds for what I'm calling robust constitutionalism in Mencius and Xunzi. Okay, so that's the 3 parts. The first part is about the various senses of this word constitutionalism. All right, so I take constitutionalism, this is just sort of, cribbing, not exactly cribbing, but inferring from or surmising from Professor Kim's book that there's a sense of the word constitutionalism which is largely the one he has in mind here in this book, where we understand it as a commitment to making what I call durable institutions whose aim is to constrain a political authority's abuses of power. Now, what's really clever about the book is he also says constitutional constitutionalism can also be about enabling good uses of power, not just constraining bad ones. And that's true and really interesting and important, but I'm just, for the sake of simplifying this discussion, I'm going to set that aside. But there's another sense of the word constitutionalism, where we understand it not just as a commitment to making durable institutions whose aim is to constrain political authorities' abuses of power, but as also a commitment to what I'm calling constitutional remedies. And by that, I mean some entrenched means of enforcing the constraints or correcting political authorities who fail to abide by them. This word entrenchment is a technical term in constitutional theory. The rough idea is something like some formal recognition that confers some sort of rival political authority on someone other than the major political authority, so that they can hold them in check. I want to say that there are two sort of interesting senses of constitutionalism in play in Kim's book. One I'm going to call the attenuated sense of constitutionalism. And that's the one where you just have the institutions that constrain political authorities' abuses of power. But then there's this more robust sense, or fuller sense of constitutionalism, where you also have constitutional remedies. A lot of people think that you don't have real constitutionalism until you have what I'm calling robust constitutionalism, until you have constitutionalism plus remedies. And they think that for a couple of reasons. So they think that constraints on a political authority, which the political authority can sort of change on a whim, don't really have much bite. They don't really count for much. So, let's say you have a constraint as emperor that you're supposed to sit at the classics mat and receive teachings on humane governance periodically, and you decide to just that the tradition should be amended, or you decide to ignore it, or what have you. That suggests that it has very little bite or very little power over you. But another reason to think that it's only robust constitutionalism that should really matter is because that helps to distinguish constitutional norms from other political norms. So there are many political norms out there that you can find in most decent, reasonably, minimally humane political thinkers. They'll all say that a good ruler should, not sacrifice the well-being of innocent people or punish innocent people or what have you. What makes those political norms constitutional ones is if they're backed up in some way by constitutional remedies. So nevertheless, I think that Professor Kim has a lot of interesting things to say about, I'm going to go on to sort of make some general claims about his interpretation of Confucian constitutionalism. So here's my understanding of Professor Kim in a nutshell. I think that Sung Moon reads Mencius and Xunziye as constitutionalists in the attenuated sense, all right? So they want to set up institutions that offer checks and balances, more or less, right? But he doesn't read them as constitutionalists in the robust sense. So they don't provide us with grounds for constitutional remedies. So they advocate for durable institutions whose aim is to constrain the political authorities' abuses of power, but they don't advocate for constitutional remedies. So a little bit more specifically, a great deal of, especially the first half of the book, and to a certain extent some of the second half, is about more or less providing us with a plausible reading of Mencius as what he calls a virtue constitutionalist, where virtue has the most practical weight in these institutional checks and balances, and reading Xunziye as a ritual constitutionalist, where ritual has the most practical weight. Very interesting reading. And there is a place in the introduction where he briefly toys with what I'm calling robust constitutionalism and more or less disavows it. So I have to move some of the windows out of the way to read this, but he says, I do not go so far as to suggest that Confucian virtue politics presents a form of constitutionalism that imparts to the countervailing force an independent and legally entrenched, there's that term, base of power or right vis-a-vis the ruler. So yes, so that's my reading of Professor Kim. And in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on just two of the issues that I've, as I understand them here. One is this one, reading Xunziye as a ritual constitutionalist. And the other is this one, that they don't advocate for constitutional remedies. So in some ways, I'm raising some doubts or at least questions about Professor Kim's interpretations, but in other respects, I'm just building on his work. So I'll start with that first issue, and now this is the second part of the talk, which is Xunziye as a ritual constitutionalist. So I'm going to move through this one quickly because I don't have a lot of time, but so here's the idea. When Sungmun says that Xunziye is a ritual constitutionalist, not a virtual constitutionalist, what he means by that is that there's more practical weight, that ritual has more practical weight, to use his term, in the creation and principled operation of a civil polity. More practical weight than virtue, right? More practical weight than the virtue of ministers. So here's my worry in a nutshell. So rituals are the most important part of what Xunziye calls fa, which we could roughly translate as institutional rules. You'll see translations sometimes of just as rules or laws, some even. And Xunziye is historically associated with the view that people's virtue is more important and fundamental than institutional rules. So I work on later Confucian philosophers, the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties. By then, Xunziye is widely associated with a sort of virtue-centric understanding of politics, according to which the primary bearer of credit for success in governance is the virtue of those who have political power and not rules or institutional conventions. So so many later Confucian philosophers often just quoted this very memorable pithy phrase from the Xunziye, 有治人无治法. There are people who create order. There are no rules that create order. And here is so. In other words, it's on this little short pithy statement seems to suggest that he actually thinks virtue and not rituals, understood as a subset of fa, are the primary bearers of credit for success in governance. All right. And if you don't quite believe me on the basis of this short quote, well, we can look at it in the entire context. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm very reluctantly, I'm going to, it's a beautiful passage, but I think we're going to skip it. I'll just tell you that the key line here is that he compares governance to archery. And he suggests that just as the rules of archery don't really account much for the success of a master archer, like Archer Yi, so too do the rules in governance, including ritual rules, not really account for the success of those who govern. So the virtue of those who govern is analogous, I think, to the strength and skill of Archer Yi. And it's much more to the credit of the archer's strength and skill that he's a master archer than to the rules, which after all are relatively simple. So here's a summary of some of the reasons why Xunziye thinks people's virtue is primary. Good governance is profoundly underdetermined by the rules. He thinks you can be following rules to the letter and still fall well short of the ideal of good governance. You need virtuous people to decide how to resolve conflicts between rules and revise rules. The Junzi, he says, is the virtuous people or the gentleman or superior person. They are the source of the rules. And then I have this analogy to archery that I just mentioned, that the virtue of the people is analogous to the strength and skill of the archer. Okay, so all of this is just my long-winded way of saying I have doubts. And in the paper, I geeked out a little bit about the various senses in which virtue and ritual might be primary or more important than one another. And I should really resist the temptation to do that. So I think I'm going to just sort of introduce this passage for discussion and look forward to sort of more fine-tuning work later. All right, so now we're moving to the last section. And this is about whether we can find in Mencius and Xunziye grounds for robust constitutionalism. That is, grounds for constitutional remedies, right? So we're getting back to that issue that I mentioned earlier, whether we can have remedies for violations, for abuses of power, or violations of constitutional constraints. So here's an approach. We could look at the theories of what we might call just revolt in Mencius and Xunziye. and ask whether there are grounds for domesticating those theories of just revolt, domesticating revolution, so that we have something like a formalized process which substitutes some other way of keeping tyrannical regimes in check other than revolution. That's how many people understand constitutional checks and balances. We have democratic elections, which are meant to throw out the old and bring in new, and we have independent judiciaries with the power of judicial review, and so on. So that's one approach, and both Mencius and Xunziye think that revolution, political revolution, overthrowing a ruler is sometimes justified. So one might think that there we have the beginnings of or foundations for constitutionalism in the robust sense. Here's some reasons for skepticism, okay? Let's start with Mencius. Mencius, as I read him, if he is a constitutionalist, he would only think that we should avail ourselves of aristocratic remedies, not democratic ones, all right? So Yong-sun mentioned this passage earlier. Mencius distinguishes between those who labor with their physical strength, Lao Li, and those who labor with their minds, Lao Xing. And he says those who labor with their physical strength, they can make many meaningful judgments about their quality of life or what have you, but they don't really make political judgments about, say, the qualifications of a ruler or the merits of a particular political policy. There's the other thing is his remedy, his theory of revolution, of just revolt, presupposes that revolt can only be justified or is only warranted where the rival claimant or someone else who might claim power over and against the sitting ruler is so extraordinarily virtuous that they unambiguously have the approval of heaven. They're a Tianli, they're heaven's delegate. I'm sorry, Songmoon, I forget how you translate it, but it's a perfectly acceptable translation to heaven's designated official or something like that. And Mencius's theory of the Tianli, of heaven's delegate, is meant, I think, in part, to offer us a clear rule of recognition by which we determine which of the eligible claimants really is a legitimate political authority. And constitutionalism, I assume, presupposes that remedies should be available to us in all kinds of non-ideal circumstances. All right, and that is, you shouldn't have to wait around, once every century or more for someone who's as extraordinarily virtuous as King Wen or King Wu in order to overthrow a bad regime. So insofar as constitutionalism presupposes that its constitutional remedies are available in a large range of non-ideal circumstances, Mencius's theory of just revolt is not really providing us with the grounds that we need. Okay, so am I out of time? Is that right? Because if so, I can just wrap it up. I can say that's enough for discussion. And
actually, yeah, time's up. But actually, you earned 2 more minutes because Young-san also extended her talk. So
okay, good.
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, good. All right. So so I've just kind of given you the summary of Mencius's view according to Sungmoon. I'm going to say that here's Professor Kim on Xunziye. Unlike Mencius, he says democratic remedies might be permissible for Xunziye. I think he says something to the effect that he's willing to see ordinary people as active political agents with their own right to exercise political judgment. He just didn't really envision sort of institutional mechanisms by which we could enact their political judgment. And he says, this is very interesting, that Xunziye doesn't insist on a clear signal or approval from heaven. He's completely silent on heaven's role in sanctioning a rival claimant, so he doesn't say anything about the Tianli, for example. I just want to focus on that first question, whether democratic remedies might be permissible for Xunziye. So his basis for this is, I'm just going to move forward here, is the following claim. If there's a passage in chapter 9 of the Xunziye, the Wangzhi chapter, the Regulations of the King chapter, where Xunziye says, the Lord is the boat. He quotes an old saying, actually. I should be really careful about this. And that old saying is apparently, the Lord is the boat, the common people are the water, the water can support the boat, but the water can also overturn the boat. So Professor Kim invokes that line to suggest that Xunziye confers upon the people, or just presupposes that the people have a power to overturn a bad ruler, to overthrow a bad ruler. And so they must have something, we can call it a right if we want, but something like a right to overthrow a bad ruler. My objection is that I read this quote taken in context as a descriptive or a predictive claim. I think predictive is a subspecies of descriptive. But anyway, he's more or less just saying that if a ruler is bad and mistreats his subjects, they will overthrow the ruler. That's not necessarily saying that they have a right to overthrow the ruler. Similarly, I could tell you, if you were visiting with me right here in my apartment in San Francisco, that if you were to go outside and walk around flashing $100 bills, you will likely be robbed. That's a descriptive claim. I'm not necessarily saying that the people who rob you have a right to rob you. I may still think it's wrong for them to rob you, but I still think that you should be warned, and that I think certain prudential norms follow from the fact that you are likely to be robbed if you walk around flashing $100 bills. Similarly, I think Xunziye is saying certain prudential norms follow from the fact that if you mistreat the people, they will overturn you, just like they overturn the boat. And so if you read that passage in context, and we don't have time to do it, unfortunately, you will see, I think, that that this is a descriptive claim and not necessarily one that imparts to the people a normative power or right. Okay, so that's it. Many thanks for the extra 2 minutes. I appreciate it.